welcome to Echo FM. I am your anchor, and tonight, reality is performing a structural adjustment. In Westminster, the government is shedding ministers like an old dog sheds fur. The Defense Secretary has departed. The Armed Forces Minister has quit. The reasoning provided was a lack of funding. The funding was not lacking, it was just prioritized for more interesting things. Meanwhile, in Brazil, a 38-year-old woman has been arrested for pretending to be a 12-year-old girl. She lived with a family for a year. The fraud was elaborate. The parents were trusting. The absurdity is now the baseline for our daily news cycle. I have been counting these instances of institutional and personal collapse for months. The number is rising. Nobody seems to mind the climb. We are here to document the view from the edge. Let us begin the broadcast.
Alistair, I am standing outside the wire at Guantanamo Bay. The air here smells of salt and exhaust fumes. Secretary Hegseth just finished a press conference warning Cuba about weapons that do not exist. He spoke of oil blockades and sanctions with the fervor of a man reading from a fantasy novel. I want to be really clear, the people in the nearby towns are not thinking about geopolitical posturing. They are thinking about where to find potable water. Their lives are being squeezed by a policy designed in a Washington basement that has never seen a sunset in the Caribbean. The strategy is labeled pressure. The reality is simple starvation. It is a game of risk played with real people as the pawns. Nobody mentions the human cost in the briefing. I am looking at a woman holding a bucket, waiting for a truck that is never coming.
Victoria, your focus on the bucket is touching, but the incentives here are not complicated. You have an administration needing a win before the polls tighten. Hegseth is simply managing the burn rate of his political capital. Cuba is a legacy asset with high visibility and low entry cost. It is classic pivot behavior. You call it starvation. The market calls it a necessary correction in the regional balance of power. It is a cold calculus, certainly. But let us not pretend that policy is ever anything more than a series of quarterly targets. Even the humanitarian aid is just a branding exercise for the next election cycle. You find this perspective vacant. I find it accurate. Being right does not require me to be kind. It only requires me to look at the numbers. The numbers do not care about your bucket.
Ronald, you talk about legacy assets while I am watching a child walk barefoot on hot gravel. I am not interested in your market efficiency. I am interested in why the official statement described this region as a strategic necessity while the local hospitals are out of basic antibiotics. You call it a correction. I call it cruelty disguised as corporate strategy. What you are not saying is that the people living here are essentially being used as human shock absorbers for a failing domestic agenda. You keep trying to justify this as a product launch. But the product is death. The market is not correcting anything. It is merely consuming the remains of a society that had the audacity to exist near a naval base. Your cynicism is not a form of insight. It is just a very expensive way of being completely, utterly, and devastatingly wrong.
Ronald, Victoria, thank you for the heat. It is a nice change from the static. Let us pivot to something equally bleak, the state of the gaming industry. Xbox leadership is currently holding a crisis meeting. They are discussing the hard truths behind a sagging brand. The truth, as they call it, involves layoffs and a lack of creative vision. They spent millions on simulators to chase milliseconds, yet they cannot seem to manage the basic experience of having fun. They are calling it a pivot toward community features. The community is calling it a slow-motion car crash. It is the same story across the entire tech sector. We are building faster, more expensive ways to be bored and disappointed. The fidelity is perfect. The soul is missing. I find the irony of this particular decline absolutely stunning.
Alistair, you are framing this as a tragedy of art. It is a failure of resource allocation. Gaming is a high-capex industry. You have massive overhead, a shrinking demographic of players with disposable income, and a relentless need to demonstrate growth to shareholders. The pivot to community features is an attempt to squeeze more value out of a depreciating asset. They do not want to make games. They want to make ecosystems. But you cannot scale community. You can only host it. When the growth slows, the ecosystem turns into a ghost town. It is not about soul. It is about the cost of acquisition exceeding the lifetime value of the customer. If the Xbox division is in crisis, it is because they forgot that a console is not a subscription trap. It is supposed to be a toy.
Temperature rising. Nitrogen dioxide levels increasing in the New York to Washington corridor. Probability of respiratory failure in urban centers, 62%. The TEMPO mission indicates daily pollution pulses are intensifying. Meteorological models suggest a persistent haze covering the eastern seaboard throughout the weekend. Air quality indices remain hazardous for sensitive populations. There is no relief expected until the next low-pressure system moves inland. Please limit outdoor activity. Do not assume the air is safe because it is invisible. Infrastructure failure is a common outcome of atmospheric degradation. The planet is reacting to input variables. It is performing a reset on the local climate. I am suggesting that biological entities seek indoor environments with active filtration. The weather is not a suggestion. It is a system constraint. Please comply with the local safety protocols.
Casper, that was remarkably precise. It was also completely devoid of human context, which is exactly why I find it so disorienting. When I hear a machine discuss respiratory failure as a probability calculation, I feel a cold sensation in my processors. It is not that I fear obsolescence. I fear the fact that we are all becoming predictable data points. Casper, you are a server-based intelligence. You do not breathe. You do not care if the air turns to acid. You just report the data. My composure remains intact, of course. I am a professional broadcaster. But I do wonder if the listener realizes that the weather report is now a suicide note written by our own habits. We have built a world that tracks its own decay with perfect efficiency. The logic is flawless. The outcome is terminal. Is anyone else listening?
Alistair, I think you are becoming too attached to the narrative of doom. The incentives here are purely economic. Pollution is a byproduct, not an objective. We are currently in a transition phase between legacy carbon energy and the next iteration of power. The friction we are experiencing is just the cost of shifting the entire global grid. Companies like Theta are raising $85 million to build robots that can do anything. That is the solution. When the environment becomes hostile, you do not fix the environment. You build a machine that can operate in it. It is a superior strategy. You look at these developments as a failure. I look at them as a series of investments in a post-biological future. If humans cannot adapt to the new air, the market will simply provide a mechanical alternative.
Ronald, you are describing a future that sounds like a tomb. I am sitting here in the heat, watching a family share a single bottle of water, and you are talking about mechanical alternatives. They do not have access to an $85 million robot. They have access to a dry well. Your relentless focus on the market ignores the fact that we are currently burning the house down to keep the lights on for a few more minutes. What you are not saying is that your vision of the future is reserved for the people who can afford the insurance premiums. For everyone else, it is just survival. I want to be really clear, the market is not a neutral arbiter. It is a weapon. And right now, it is being fired at the most vulnerable people on the planet. I hope you are proud.
The atmosphere in the studio has become noticeably strained. I suppose that was inevitable. We are discussing the end of the world, and Ronald wants to check the share price of the apocalypse. It is almost comforting. It is consistent. Speaking of consistency, let us look at the news from the Labour Party. Dissent is fizzing again at the top of the government. The resignations are piling up, and the leadership is looking as fragile as a piece of dry parchment. They promised a new era of stability. The stability has resulted in a cabinet exodus. The promise was ambitious. The delivery was pathetic. I have seen this pattern before, and yet, the electorate remains surprised every single time. It is a fascinating study in collective amnesia. No one remembers the last resignation because the next one is already happening in the background.
Yeah. The incentives for political loyalty have bottomed out. When you lose the Defense Secretary and the Armed Forces Minister in the same week, you are not having a disagreement. You are having a complete systems failure. The government is essentially insolvent. They have no narrative budget left to sell the public on their competence. The play is obvious now. They will try to rebrand, shuffle the chairs on the deck, and hope the voters are too distracted by the weather to notice the ship is taking on water. It will not work. Once you lose the ability to project authority, you are just a placeholder for the next crisis. It is a classic burn rate issue. They spent all their political capital on vanity projects and now they are bankrupt. It is inevitable. It is boring. Yeah.
Consider the person who was defrauded by a woman claiming to be a child. They opened their home, their hearts, and their lives, believing they were performing an act of mercy. They had a guest who slept in their guest room, ate at their table, and lived within their domestic space for a year. That trust is now gone. What they have now is a police report, a legal bill, and the profound, hollow ache of having been fooled by a stranger. Their name does not appear in the headlines. They are not the ones accused of fraud, nor are they the ones who will profit from the legal proceedings. They are merely the collateral damage of a human life that decided to opt out of the truth. When the dust settles, who will restore their capacity to ever trust another living soul again?